Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Mount Hood rafting trips were my escape after the divorce in 2012. Every weekend that June, I'd drive up from Portland and lose myself in the rapids, the cold spray washing away whatever mess I'd left behind in the city. My coworker Beth had been pushing me to join her regular rafting group, and I finally gave in on a Thursday afternoon when the forecast promised clear skies through the weekend. 6 of us met at the launch point near government camp. Beth with her boyfriend Nathan, a couple from Portland named Grace and Frank, and Oliver from the outdoor gear shop where we'd rented our equipment. Oliver had these unsettling green eyes that never quite focused on you when he talked, always scanning the tree line or studying the water like he was reading some invisible map. The White River ran muddy that morning, churning with more debris than usual. Broken branches, chunks of bark, even what looked like pieces of old lumber spinning in the current. Our guide Chuck kept checking his phone and muttering about upstream weather reports, but the company had already taken our money, and nobody wanted to look like the scared one who backed out. We launched around 10 a.m., and for the first hour, everything felt normal enough. Nathan cracked jokes about his terrible paddling technique while Grace shrieked every time we hit minor rapids. Oliver stayed silent in the back of our raft, those green eyes fixed on the canyon walls rising around us. Then the watercolor changed from brown to this thick, almost black shade, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees in the span of minutes. Chuck started barking orders, telling us to paddle hard for the right bank, but the current had already picked up to something I'd never experienced before. The raft spun sideways, and I watched Frank's paddle get ripped from his hands like a toothpick. Grace was screaming now, real terror, not the playful shrieks from earlier. The roar of water became deafening, not just our river but something massive approaching from upstream. I caught a glimpse of a wall of brown water carrying entire trees before our raft flipped. The impact felt like getting hit by a car. Cold water forced itself down my throat, up my nose, tumbling me in complete darkness. I remember my helmet cracking against rocks, Oliver's green windbreaker flashing past, then nothing but churning chaos. When I broke the surface, gasping and choking, half the group was gone. Beth clung to an overturned raft maybe 50 feet downstream, Nathan nowhere in sight. I couldn't see Frank or Grace at all, but Oliver was right there, his arm locked around my life vest, dragging me toward the bank with surprising strength. The current kept trying to pull us back into the main channel where debris the size of cars tumbled past. We slammed into a concrete structure jutting from the bank, and Oliver shoved me up onto it before hauling himself after me. My whole body shook uncontrollably, teeth chattering so hard I thought they'd crack. Oliver's face had a deep gash across his forehead, blood mixing with river water as it ran down his cheek. The concrete platform we'd landed on turned out to be the entrance to some kind of drainage tunnel, maybe 8 feet in diameter, disappearing into the hillside. Oliver's breathing came in short, painful gasps, and when he tried to stand, his left leg buckled completely. The bone wasn't breaking through skin, but the angle was all wrong below his knee. He let out this sound, not quite a scream, more like air being forced from a punctured tire. The rain started then, not normal rain, but sheets of water so thick I could barely see 10 feet. The river rose visibly, brown water lapping higher on our concrete platform every few seconds. We needed shelter fast, and that tunnel was our only option. I wrapped Oliver's arm around my shoulders and half dragged him into the tunnel mouth. The temperature inside dropped another 10 degrees, and our voices echoed strangely in the dark. About 20 feet in, I found a dry ledge where old flood debris had collected. Plastic bottles, chunks of styrofoam, tangled fishing line. I lowered Oliver onto it and tried my phone. No signal, just that mocking, emergency calls only message. Oliver's skin had taken on this grayish color, and he kept mumbling about seeing lights deeper in the tunnel. I thought he was going into shock until I turned around and saw them too. Faint yellow glows, like old industrial lighting, coming from somewhere far back in the darkness. Every instinct told me to stay put, wait for rescue. But Oliver needed real medical attention. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, and when I touched his forehead, the skin felt cold and clammy despite the gash still seeping blood. I told him I'd check out the lights, maybe find a maintenance exit or emergency phone. The tunnel curved after about 100 feet, and the concrete gave way to older construction, red brick with rusted metal brackets every few yards. The yellow lights grew brighter, and I could hear something else now, a low electrical hum and what sounded like water dripping in a large space. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber where 3 other passages branched off. Old mining equipment lay rusted against the walls, cart rails, pickaxes, helmets with carbide lamps still attached. The lights came from a string of construction bulbs jury-rigged along the ceiling, their thick orange cables snaking toward the leftmost tunnel. Fresh footprints marked the dusty floor, dozens of them, different sizes, some barefoot. The smell hit me then. Human waste, rotting food, and something else, sweet and chemical like antifreeze mixed with decay. I followed the lights into the left tunnel and found myself in what must have been an old bunkhouse for miners. Rows of metal bed frames lined the walls, but these weren't abandoned. Filthy mattresses covered most of them, sleeping bags and blankets in various states of decay. Syringes littered the floor, along with glass pipes and scorched spoons. But it was the back wall that made me stop breathing. Photographs, dozens of them, tacked up with rusty nails. Missing person flyers, driver's licenses, social security cards. Some looked recent. Others were water-damaged and fading. A wet cough echoed from deeper in the complex, followed by voices. Multiple people, their words slurred and overlapping. I grabbed a driver's license from the wall, hands trembling as I recognized the photo. A woman from Gresham who'd gone missing 3 months ago during a hiking trip. The local news had covered it extensively. More sounds now. Shuffling feet, metal scraping against stone. I backed toward the tunnel entrance, but footsteps were coming from that direction too. They were between me and Oliver. I ducked behind an overturned mining cart just as 2 figures emerged from the shadows. One was a woman, probably in her 40s, wearing multiple layers of stained clothing. Her companion was younger, maybe 20, with infected sores covering his arms and neck. They moved with the careful steps of people navigating in partial darkness, even though the lights were working fine. The woman stopped at one of the mattresses and pulled something from underneath. A clear plastic bag filled with wallets, watches, rings. She dumped the contents onto the bed and began sorting through them with practiced efficiency. The younger man wandered to a corner where I now noticed several coolers stacked against the wall. He opened one, and the smell that escaped made bile rise in my throat. I couldn't see what was inside from my hiding spot, but the woman snapped at him to close it, said they needed to wait for the others to get back from the river, said the flood always brought opportunities, and today's group had been perfect. Tourists with good gear, probably carrying cash. My phone was still in my pocket and I carefully pulled it out, desperate to document this, but the screen's light would give me away instantly. More voices echoed from the main tunnel. 3, maybe 4 people returning. The woman called out to them, asking if they'd found anyone else. A man's voice responded that they'd pulled 2 more from the water, but only one was still breathing. My heart hammered against my ribs as I heard them dragging something heavy across the ground. I had to get back to Oliver. Using the noise as cover, I crept from behind the cart and slipped into a different tunnel, hoping it would loop back to where I'd left him. The passage was narrower, older, with wooden support beams that looked ready to collapse. After what felt like hours but was probably minutes, I heard Oliver's labored breathing ahead. He was where I'd left him, but his eyes had rolled back, showing only whites. I shook him gently, whispered his name, and his eyes focused briefly on mine. That's when I heard them in the main drainage tunnel, multiple footsteps getting closer. I made a choice that still haunts me. Oliver couldn't move fast enough, and trying to carry him would get us both caught. I found a small alcove behind some debris, tucked him as far back as possible, and covered him with trash and old tarps. I promised I'd come back with help, though we both knew I was lying. Then I ran. Not deeper into the complex, but back toward the entrance, toward the flood. The voices behind me grew louder, angry when they realized someone had been in their space. I burst from the tunnel to find the water had risen dramatically, brown torrents racing past just feet from the entrance. Without thinking, I jumped. The current grabbed me instantly, slamming me into rocks, spinning me in the churning darkness. I went under twice, 3 times, lungs screaming, before the river finally spat me out onto a gravel bar a mile downstream, where a search and rescue team found me 20 minutes later. They found Beth and Nathan alive, clinging to trees 2 miles downstream. Frank's body was recovered 3 days later. Grace and Oliver were never found. I told the police everything: the tunnel, the old mining complex, the people living there, the wall of missing persons, the coolers. I even showed them the driver's license I'd grabbed. They sent teams to investigate, but the tunnel I described had supposedly been sealed in 2003 after a structural collapse. The entrance I'd used was completely submerged, and when the water receded weeks later, they found only smooth concrete where I swore the opening had been. The driver's license was real, but they said I could have found it anywhere in the flood debris. No evidence of squatters, no mining complex, no photographs on walls. The official report lists Oliver as a flood victim, presumed drowned. They suggested trauma and hypothermia had caused me to hallucinate, but I know what I saw in that place. And sometimes, when it rains hard enough, I think about those coolers and what the woman didn't want open too early, and I understand why Oliver never made it out. The Appalachian Mountains have always called to me, something about their ancient ridges and misty mornings that makes you feel connected to something bigger. I was working as a freelance graphic designer back in 2018, burning out from too many corporate projects and late nights staring at screens. My girlfriend Lisa and I decided we needed a real break, not just a weekend in Asheville, but actual time in the wilderness. We picked Mount Mitchell because it's the highest peak east of the Mississippi, and neither of us had been there before. The plan was simple: 3 days of hiking, camping at designated spots, and disconnecting from everything digital. We drove up from Charlotte on a Thursday morning in early October, when the leaves were just starting to turn, but the weather was still mild enough for comfortable camping. The first sign that our trip would be different happened at the trailhead parking lot. While we were organizing our packs and double-checking our water supply, I noticed a man standing near the forest edge, maybe 30 feet away. He wore faded jeans and a dark green flannel shirt. No backpack, no hiking boots, just regular work boots that looked like they'd seen better days. His hair was gray and unkempt, hanging past his shoulders, and he had this weathered face that made it impossible to guess his age. Could have been 40, could have been 60. What struck me most was how still he stood, just watching us with pale blue eyes that never seemed to blink. Lisa didn't notice him at first, busy adjusting her pack straps. But when I nudged her and pointed, he'd already turned and walked into the trees, moving with this odd, fluid grace that didn't match his rough appearance. We started our hike around noon, taking the Deep Gap Trail that winds through dense spruce and fir forests. The first 2 hours were perfect: cool air, birds calling, the satisfying crunch of pine needles under our boots. Lisa kept stopping to photograph mushrooms and moss-covered logs, while I focused on the rhythm of walking and breathing clean mountain air. About 3 miles in, we reached a small clearing with a view of distant peaks and decided to take a water break. That's when I saw him again, the same man from the parking lot, standing on a rocky outcrop maybe 50 yards uphill from us. Same clothes, same stance, same unblinking stare. The weird thing was we'd been moving at a decent pace and hadn't seen anyone pass us on the narrow trail. Lisa saw him too this time, and we exchanged confused looks. When I called out a friendly, "Hey there," and waved, he didn't respond, just stood there like a statue carved from the mountain itself. Maybe he knows a shortcut, Lisa suggested, trying to rationalize it as we packed up and continued hiking. but shortcuts through this terrain didn't make sense. The undergrowth was thick with rhododendron tangles, and the slopes were steep enough that bushwhacking would be exhausting and dangerous. We kept going, both of us glancing back occasionally, but the man had vanished again. The trail grew steeper as we climbed toward the ridge, switchbacking through sections where you had to use roots and rocks as handholds. My legs were burning, and Lisa was breathing hard when we finally reached a flatter section near a small stream. We'd been hiking for almost 4 hours by then, and decided to filter some water and eat energy bars. I was kneeling by the stream, pump filtering water into our bottles, when Lisa grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. I looked where she was pointing. Across the stream, maybe 20 feet away, stood the man, partially hidden behind a massive hemlock trunk. This time he wasn't just watching. He was smiling, this slow, deliberate expression that showed yellowed teeth. His clothes looked exactly the same, not a spot of sweat or dirt despite the brutal terrain he'd somehow navigated. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes on him, and called out again, louder this time. "You need help? Are you lost?" No response, just that awful smile widening slightly. Lisa whispered that we should leave immediately, and I agreed. We packed up fast, not bothering to finish filtering water, and started hiking again at a pace that was probably too quick for the altitude. My heart was hammering, and not just from exertion. Every few minutes one of us would look back, but we didn't see him. The trail wound through a section of dead trees, victims of the balsam woolly adelgid, their white skeletons standing like sentinels in the fog that had started rolling in. We reached our designated camping spot around 6, a small cleared area with a fire ring and space for a few tents. 2 other groups were already there, a family with teenage kids and an older couple with expensive gear. The normal sight of other hikers felt like a massive relief. While setting up our tent, I quietly asked the older couple if they'd seen anyone odd on the trails. The man, who introduced himself as Bill from Raleigh, got this strange look on his face. "Gray hair, no pack?" he asked. When I nodded, he told us they'd seen the same man 3 times that day, always ahead of them somehow, always watching. His wife Joyce added that she'd hiked this mountain for 20 years and had heard stories about someone like that. A hermit or something who lived up here illegally, following hikers for reasons nobody understood. She said it in this matter-of-fact way that made my skin prickle. As darkness fell and we all sat around our respective camp stoves cooking dinner, I kept scanning the tree line, expecting to see those pale eyes reflecting our headlamp beams. That night was rough. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me bolt upright in my sleeping bag. Lisa tried to calm me down, said it was probably just deer or raccoons, but I could tell she was scared too by the way she kept checking that the tent zippers were fully closed. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling our campsite. Not the random movement of wildlife, but measured human steps on the packed dirt. I lay there, barely breathing, as the footsteps paused right outside our tent. Through the thin nylon wall, I could hear breathing, ragged and wet, like someone with fluid in their lungs. Lisa was awake too, her hand finding mine in the darkness, squeezing so hard her nails dug into my palm. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then the footsteps moved away, toward the other tents. I heard a zipper somewhere, maybe Bill and Joyce's tent, and muffled voices. Then nothing. Just the wind in the dead trees and my own thundering heartbeat. Morning came as a relief, gray and foggy but wonderfully normal. The family with teenagers was already packing up when we emerged, the parents looking haggard and the kids unusually quiet. Bill told us they'd heard the footsteps too, said he'd even looked out with his flashlight but saw nothing. We all agreed to hike out together, safety in numbers and all that. The plan was to take the most direct route back to the parking area, skipping the rest of our planned loop. As we broke camp, I noticed something that made my throat close up. Boot prints in the soft earth around our tents, dozens of them, like someone had spent hours walking circles around us. The prints led off in every direction, disappearing into the forest. Joyce pointed out that some of the prints seemed to go straight up steep slopes, that would be nearly impossible to climb in darkness. We left fast after that, nobody talking much, just the sound of hurried footsteps and heavy breathing as we practically ran down the trail. About an hour into our descent, the fog thickened until we could barely see 30 feet ahead. We had to slow down, couldn't risk someone slipping on the wet rocks. That's when things got worse. The man appeared again, but this time he wasn't alone. Through the fog we could see shapes, 3, maybe 4 figures, all dressed similarly in worn work clothes, all with that same long gray hair. They stood at different points around us, visible through gaps in the fog like a coordinated formation. The teenager in our group, a boy named Ryan, started crying, and his dad pulled him close. Bill had his hiking poles raised like weapons, though we all knew how useless that would be. The figures didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in the fog. Then Lisa noticed something that made her gasp. One of them was wearing a faded orange bandana around his neck, the same kind of bandana we'd seen in a missing hiker poster at the ranger station. The poster had been dated from last summer. We bunched together and kept moving, practically shuffling as a single unit down the trail. The figures followed, always maintaining the same distance, appearing and disappearing in the fog like ghosts. At one point, we reached a section where the trail split, and Joyce suggested we take the longer route that went past the ranger station instead of straight to the parking lot. Nobody argued. As we changed direction, I saw one of the figures step out onto the trail behind us, and for the first time, I got a clear look at his face in profile. His skin had this gray pallor, like someone who'd been sick for a long time, and his eyes, they weren't quite right. Too wide, too bright, pupils dilated despite the daylight. He opened his mouth as if to speak, and I saw his teeth were filed to points. Not naturally sharp, deliberately filed. I grabbed Lisa and pushed her forward, telling everyone to move faster. We half ran, half stumbled down that trail, backpacks bouncing, lungs burning from the thin mountain air. The ranger station appeared through the fog like a miracle. A small wooden building with smoke rising from the chimney. We burst through the door in a chaotic pile of bodies and backpacks, startling the 2 rangers inside. They took one look at our faces and immediately went into emergency mode. The older ranger, a woman with short silver hair and kind eyes, locked the door behind us while the younger man radioed for backup. As we tried to explain, stumbling over our words, the woman's expression grew increasingly grim. She walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder, spreading photos and reports across her desk. Dozens of sightings, going back to 1987. Photos of boot prints in impossible places. Testimonies from traumatized hikers, and worse, missing person reports, at least 15 of them, all last seen on trails where the gray-haired men had been spotted. She explained that they'd been trying to catch these people for years, believed they were part of some group living deep in the most inaccessible parts of the mountain, possibly in the cave systems that riddled the area. The younger ranger, Dale, was staring out the window when he suddenly stepped back. "They're here," he said quietly. Through the glass, we could see them, not 3 or 4 anymore, but at least a dozen figures standing at the edge of the clearing just beyond the fog line. All men, all with that same long gray hair, all perfectly still. The older ranger, who'd introduced herself as Captain Torres, grabbed her radio and called for immediate evacuation and law enforcement backup. She told us these men had never approached the station before, never come this close to civilization. While we waited for help, she shared theories. Maybe they were descendants of moonshiners who'd gone feral generations ago. Maybe a cult that had retreated to the mountains. Maybe something stranger. Nobody really knew. The state police arrived within an hour, along with a search and rescue team. They escorted us to our cars while a team prepared to sweep the area. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the figures had vanished, melted back into their mountain. The police found nothing. No tracks, no camps, no sign they'd ever been there. But Captain Torres called me a week later. They'd found something in one of the deeper cave systems, makeshift living spaces, stolen gear from missing hikers, and scratches on the walls that looked like tallies. Hundreds and hundreds of tallies. The voicemail from Uncle Hank came on a Thursday afternoon while I was fixing a busted carburetor at the shop. His gravelly voice cut through the garage noise. "Your mom's lawyer gave me your number. Got something of your dad's you might want. Come to Banner Elk if you're interested." That was it. No hello, no explanation, just those clipped sentences after 11 years of silence. I wiped the grease off my hands and played it again. Mom had been gone 4 months, and suddenly the brother-in-law who'd vanished from our lives the same week Dad disappeared wanted to talk. At 27, I figured I could handle whatever he had to say. 3 days later, I was driving through morning fog on Highway 105, watching the Blue Ridge peaks emerge like broken teeth against the sky. Banner Elk felt smaller than my memories. The Peabody's grocery where Dad used to buy his trail supplies had become a CBD shop, but the Sunrise Diner still served the same bitter coffee in the same cracked mugs. I found Hank there on my second morning in town, hunched over scrambled eggs in the corner booth. He'd aged hard, deep lines carved into his face, hair gone completely white, shoulders curved inward like he was protecting something. His eyes flicked up when I slid into the seat across from him, and for a moment I saw Dad, in the way his eyebrows pulled together. "Jesus, kid," he muttered, setting down his fork. "You look just like him. Same stubborn set to your mouth and everything." His fingers drummed against the Formica table, and I noticed they trembled slightly. Whatever he'd called me here for, it was eating at him. "Your dad's Timex," he said after a long silence, sliding a scratched watch across the table. "Found it last month when they were doing construction up near the old Beach Mountain Service Road. Figured you should have it." The watch face was cracked, the leather band stained dark with what might have been mud or something else. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it, remembering how Dad used to tap it constantly when he was thinking. The date window was stuck on the 15th, 3 days after he'd left for what Mom had called a routine trail maintenance job. Hank watched me turn it over in my hands, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite spit out. "There's more," he finally said, "but not here. Too many ears in this place. You still remember how to hike?" The question hung between us like a challenge. Of course I remembered. Dad had made sure of that, dragging me up every trail in a 50-mile radius before I turned 10. Hank knew this. He was testing something else, measuring whether I had the stomach for whatever came next. "I can keep up," I told him, pocketing the watch. He nodded slowly, threw a 20 on the table, and stood up with a grunt. "Tomorrow morning, 5 sharp. Meet me at the old ranger station parking lot off 194. Bring layers and a headlamp. We'll be gone all day." He paused at the door, not quite looking back. "And kid, don't tell anyone where you're going. Some stories are better left buried, but since you're here..." He didn't finish, just pushed through the door into the morning drizzle. I barely slept that night. The motel room's heater clicked and groaned while I lay there studying Dad's watch under the lamplight. The crack in the crystal formed a spiderweb pattern, and beneath it, I could make out dried specks of something rust-colored. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and started Googling old news reports from 2011. The articles were sparse. Local trail guide goes missing. Search called off after 2 weeks due to early winter storms. No body recovered. But one detail I'd never known jumped out. Hank had been the last person to see him alive. They'd split up on the trail, planning to meet back at the trucks by sunset. Dad never showed. Now here was Hank, 11 years later, wanting to take me to that same area. My gut churned with equal parts anticipation and dread. The ranger station parking lot was empty when I pulled in at 4:55 a.m. Nothing but my headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Hank's rust-eaten Ford was already there, exhaust pipe steaming in the cold mountain air. He leaned against the tailgate wearing the same faded Carhartt jacket I remembered from childhood, a backpack at his feet. "Good, you're early," he said, shouldering the pack. "Trail's overgrown now. They stopped maintaining it after..." He didn't need to finish. After Dad disappeared, after the search teams gave up, after the Forest Service decided some paths were better left forgotten. We set off without another word. our headlamps bobbing through the mist. The trail marker had been removed, but Hank found the opening in the rhododendron thicket like muscle memory, pushing aside branches heavy with dew. The first 2 hours were silent except for our breathing and the crunch of boots on dead leaves. The trail climbed steadily through stands of hemlock and yellow birch, following what might have been an old logging road decades ago. Every so often, Hank would pause and study the trees like he was reading landmarks invisible to me. The forest felt different here. Too quiet, no bird calls, just the whisper of wind through branches. When we stopped for water near a moss-covered boulder, I finally asked, "Why now? Why bring me here after all this time?" Hank took a long drink from his bottle before answering. "Because they're planning to expand the dam. Whole area is going to be surveyed and cleared next month, if there's anything left to find." He trailed off, but his meaning was clear. This was our last chance. We reached the turnoff to the service tunnel around 9 in the morning. A chain-link fence blocked the path, rust-red signs warning about hazardous conditions and federal property. But the fence had been cut years ago, the edges curled back and weathered. Hank didn't hesitate, just ducked through like he'd done it before. Many times before, judging by the worn dirt on the other side. The tunnel entrance loomed ahead, a concrete mouth built into the mountainside, part of the old hydroelectric system from the 60s. "This is where we split up that day," Hank said quietly, his voice echoing off the rocks. "Your dad wanted to check the upper trails. I came down here to clear some fallen trees. Stupid plan." His headlamp beam swept across the tunnel entrance, and I saw his whole body tense. There were fresh scratches in the concrete, like someone had been digging at the sealed ventilation grates with tools. "Someone's been here," I stated the obvious. But Hank was already moving toward the scratches, running his fingers along the gouges in the concrete. His breathing had changed, become shallow and quick. "We need to go inside," he said, pulling a crowbar from his pack. That's when I knew he'd planned this all along. The tool was worn smooth from use, not some hardware store purchase for today. "What's in there, Hank?" I grabbed his arm before he could start prying at the grate. "What really happened to my father?" He jerked away from me, and for the first time since the diner, he looked me straight in the eyes. His face was twisted with something between grief and rage. "You want the truth? Your dad found something he shouldn't have. Company documents from the dam construction, bodies in the concrete, workers who died during the build, covered up to keep the project on schedule. He was going to expose it all." The crowbar clattered against the rocks as Hank's hands began to shake violently. I tried to stop him, told him to leave it alone, that it was 40 years old, that nobody cared about dead construction workers from the 60s. But he wouldn't listen, said those men had families who deserved to know. Hank slumped against the tunnel wall, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. The night before that last hike, someone called the house, warned him to drop it. He thought it was just intimidation tactics from the power company. But when we got up here, Hank's voice cracked. They were waiting, 3 men in hunting gear, except they weren't hunting deer. I heard the shots from down here came running, but by the time I reached the upper trail, he couldn't continue, just pointed into the darkness of the tunnel with a trembling finger. Without another word, Hank picked up the crowbar and wrenched the grate open. The metal shrieked against concrete, echoing deep into the mountain. The smell hit us immediately, damp earth, rust, and something else underneath, organic and wrong. We clicked on our headlamps and stepped inside. The tunnel stretched about 30 feet before opening into a maintenance chamber. Old electrical panels lined the walls, their gauges dark and dusty, but it was the floor that made me stop breathing. Fresh tool marks scarred the concrete in one corner, and beside them sat a pickaxe and a half-filled garbage bag. Hank moved toward it like a sleepwalker. "I've been coming back," he whispered, "every few months chipping away, trying to bring him home." Inside the bag were fragments, fabric, leather, things I didn't want to identify, and at the bottom, a wallet. Dad's driver's license stared up at me through the plastic window, his smile frozen in time. "They made me help." Hank's voice was barely audible now. "Said they'd kill me too if I didn't. We carried him down here, sealed him in with the others. I've lived with it every day since, seeing your mom at family gatherings, watching you grow up in Christmas photos." His confession dissolved into sobs. I stood there holding my father's wallet, rage and grief battling in my chest. Part of me wanted to use that crowbar on Hank, make him pay for his cowardice. But the larger part just felt empty, hollowed out by the truth. "We're taking him home," I said finally. "All of him. And then you're going to the police." Hank nodded, wiping his face with dirty hands. "I know. I've known since the day I called you. I just needed someone else to know first. Needed you to understand." We worked in silence for the next 2 hours, carefully extracting what remained. The men who'd killed him were probably dead themselves by now, or hidden behind corporate lawyers. But Dad would have a proper burial, and the truth would finally see daylight. The hike back down felt like walking through a dream. Hank carried the bag while I clutched Dad's wallet, neither of us speaking. When we reached the parking lot, the afternoon sun seemed too bright, too normal for what we'd just done. I followed Hank to the sheriff's office in town, watched him walk through those doors with his shoulders squared for the first time in 11 years. The investigation that followed made regional news. The discovery of multiple bodies in the dam structure, the decades-old cover-up. The power companies scrambled to distance themselves from contractors long dead. They found 7 other workers entombed in that concrete. Families who'd been told their loved ones had simply abandoned their jobs and disappeared. Dad's case was officially closed as a homicide, though no one would ever stand trial for it. Hank pled guilty to improper handling of human remains and got 18 months, served 9. I scattered Dad's ashes on Grandfather Mountain on a clear December morning. Just me and the wind and the view he'd loved. Mom never got to know the truth, and maybe that was a mercy. These days, I still wear his Timex, the crack in the crystal reminding me that some truths are worth dying for, and others will eat you alive if you let them. Hank writes me sometimes from Florida, where he moved after his release. I don't write back, but I don't throw the letters away either. They sit in a box with Dad's wallet and the newspaper clippings about the dam investigation. Some nights I dream about that tunnel, about the weight of mountains and the secrets they keep. But mostly I'm just glad he's not under all that concrete anymore. He's free, scattered on the wind, part of the mountains he loved. That's enough. It has to be. The call came through at 3 a.m. on a Thursday in early September. I'd been with Cumberland County Search and Rescue for about 8 years at that point, working as a volunteer whenever they needed extra hands. Living in rural Tennessee meant we got our share of missing hikers, usually city folks who underestimated the terrain or got turned around after dark. But this one felt different from the moment I picked up the phone. Sheriff Dawson's voice had this edge to it, like he was trying to convince himself everything was normal. "Got a missing kid, Madison. 17-year-old named Lucas Brenner. Parents say he went for a solo hike yesterday morning, supposed to be back by dinner. His phone's dead now, but we pulled the GPS data before it went dark." I was already pulling on my boots, phone wedged between my shoulder and ear. What he told me next made me pause with one boot half-laced. The GPS tracking showed Lucas had spent 6 hours walking in these huge, methodical circles before his phone shut off. Not the wandering pattern of someone lost or panicked, but deliberate loops, each one about a quarter mile in diameter. The really strange part was where the signal died. According to the coordinates, it was in the middle of a clearing that none of our maps showed. I knew those woods like the back of my hand, had been tramping through them since I was a kid, and there was no glade where Lucas's phone placed him. But numbers don't lie, and a missing teenager trumps any confusion about geography. I grabbed my pack, double-checked my gear, and headed out to meet the rest of the search team at the trailhead. The drive out to Copper Ridge took about 40 minutes on those winding mountain roads. Dawn was just breaking when I pulled up, painting the tree line this sick orange color that reminded me of a fever dream. 3 other volunteers were already there: Tom Hutchinson, a retired park ranger I'd worked with before, plus 2 newer guys whose names I never did catch. Sheriff Dawson spread out a topographical map on the hood of his cruiser, marking Lucas's path with a red pen. Seeing those perfect circles drawn out like that made my skin prickle. They looked almost ritualistic, like some kind of pattern you'd see in those old folklore books my grandmother used to keep. Tom noticed it too, kept shaking his head and muttering about how unnatural it looked. We divided into pairs, with me taking the direct route toward where the phone signal died. The first couple miles were standard Tennessee wilderness, thick undergrowth, moss-covered rocks, the occasional deer path cutting through the brambles. But as I got closer to those coordinates, things started changing in ways that made my chest tight. The birds went quiet first, that sudden drop in forest noise that usually means a predator's around. Then I started noticing the trees. Someone had been carving symbols into the bark, not fresh cuts, but old enough that the wood had started to heal around them. Triangles inside circles, spirals that hurt to look at too long, and these weird branching patterns that reminded me of lightning strikes or maybe veins. The carvings got denser the deeper I went, until nearly every tree had at least one mark. That's when I found the first wooden figure. It hung from a low branch right at eye level, swaying slightly even though there wasn't any wind. About the size of my palm, carved from what looked like cedar, depicting a person with too many joints in their arms and legs. The face was just a blank oval with a single hole drilled through where the mouth should be. I'd seen plenty of trail art over the years, hikers leaving little sculptures or painted rocks, but this was different. The wood was smooth from age and handling, like someone had carried it around for years before hanging it here. More figures appeared as I pushed forward, some human-shaped, others that looked like animals if animals had been designed by someone who'd only heard descriptions of them. A deer with backwards bending legs, a bird with 4 wings arranged in a cross pattern, each one perfectly positioned at eye level, spaced about 20 feet apart, creating a path deeper into the woods. My radio crackled, making me jump. Tom's voice came through mixed with static. "Madison, you finding anything weird out there? Because I'm looking at boot prints that, well, they don't make sense. Kid was wearing size 10 Nikes according to his parents, but I'm seeing prints from at least 4 different shoes, all walking in the same direction." I keyed my radio to respond, but then I saw it. There in the soft earth between 2 marked trees was a boot print I recognized. Not because I'd seen it recently, but because I'd stared at that exact tread pattern for hours 23 years ago, trying to understand why it was the only trace left of my older brother Danny. The morning he'd disappeared on a camping trip in these same woods, the search teams found just one print from his left boot, pressed deep into the mud like he'd been standing there for hours. Now I was looking at an identical print, same size, same wear pattern on the heel, even the same little nick in the rubber near the big toe. I forgot how to breathe for a second. Danny had been 14 when he vanished, just 3 years younger than Lucas was now. The official report said he probably fell into one of the hidden ravines. Body never recovered, but I'd never bought that explanation. Danny knew these woods better than anyone, used to drag me out here when I was little to show me fox dens and teach me which berries were safe to eat. The boot print in front of me looked fresh, maybe a day old at most. I reached for my radio again, but stopped when I heard something that made every hair on my arms stand up. Someone was humming. Not a tune exactly, more like a single note that kept wavering up and down, coming from somewhere ahead where the trees grew thicker. It had this quality that made it hard to tell if it was one voice or several, all holding that same shifting note. The wooden figures got stranger the closer I got to the humming. Human shapes with animal heads, animals with human hands, things that weren't quite either. All of them faced the same direction, pointing deeper into the woods like some kind of twisted trail markers. The carvings on the trees changed too, becoming more elaborate, showing scenes instead of just symbols. I saw a carved circle of people holding hands around something I couldn't make out, their heads thrown back like they were screaming, or maybe singing. Another tree showed a single figure walking between 2 rows of watchers, and even in the rough carving, I could see that the walking figure's proportions were wrong. arms too long, legs bending in too many places. The humming got louder, and underneath it, I started to hear other sounds. Footsteps moving through leaves, but the rhythm was off. Like whoever was walking kept forgetting how many legs they had. Then I stepped into the clearing that wasn't supposed to exist. It opened up suddenly, the trees just stopping in a perfect circle about 40 yards across. The ground was covered in that short, dense grass you sometimes find in old meadows, but this grass grew in spirals, creating patterns that made my eyes water if I tried to follow them too long. In the center stood Lucas, still wearing his red hiking jacket and cargo pants. He was walking those same circles I'd seen on the GPS, steady and mechanical, like he was following a track only he could see. His eyes were open but unfocused, and he was humming that same wavering note. But Lucas wasn't alone. There were others walking with him, maybe 7 or 8 people of different ages, all moving in the same circular pattern. Some wore modern clothes. Others had on stuff that looked decades old. One man in a faded flannel shirt and jeans looked exactly like the missing hiker posters from 2008. A woman in a yellowed sundress matched a photo from a 1987 cold case I'd studied during my search and rescue training. I tried to call out to Lucas, but my voice came out wrong, like I was trying to talk underwater. That's when I noticed the others standing at the edge of the clearing. They were harder to see, like my eyes kept trying to slide off them, but I could make out at least a dozen figures just standing there, watching the walkers. Some were normal-looking people in regular clothes. Others were different. Too tall, with limbs that bent in ways that made my stomach turn, faces that seemed to shift every time I tried to focus on them. One of them turned toward me, and I saw it was wearing Danny's jacket. The same blue windbreaker with the tear on the left sleeve that he'd gotten caught on a fence. But the thing wearing it wasn't Danny. It had his clothes, his height, even stood the way he used to with his weight shifted to one leg. But the face was all wrong, like someone had tried to recreate it from a blurry photograph, getting the general shape right but missing everything that had made him human. It smiled at me with too many teeth and beckoned with a hand that had too many joints. Everything in me screamed to run, but I couldn't leave Lucas. I forced myself to step into the clearing, and immediately felt like I was walking through thick syrup. The air had weight here, pressing against me from all sides. The humming got inside my head, making it hard to think straight. I pushed toward the center, trying to reach Lucas, but with each step, I felt myself starting to fall into the same rhythm as the walkers. My feet wanted to turn, to join the circle, to walk those endless loops until what? I bit down hard on my tongue, using the pain to stay focused. The thing wearing Danny's jacket moved closer, and I could see others detaching from the edge of the clearing, gliding more than walking. I grabbed Lucas's arm, and it was like touching a live wire. Images flooded my head, the woods from above, showing dozens of clearings just like this one, each with its own circle of walkers. I saw people being led here over decades, maybe centuries, following the wooden figures and carved trees like breadcrumbs. I saw what happened to the ones who completed their circles, how they got emptied out and filled with something else, something that could wear their shape but never quite get it right. The shock broke whatever spell Lucas was under. His eyes snapped into focus and he gasped like he'd been holding his breath for hours. "Run," was all I said, and thank God he listened. We crashed back through the trees, the humming turning into something like screaming behind us. I could hear those wrong-footed steps following, getting closer. The wooden figures seemed to turn their heads as we passed, and the carved trees looked different now, showing scenes of pursuit and capture. We ran until my lungs burned, Lucas stumbling beside me but keeping pace. I used my GPS to navigate, not trusting the paths anymore. Behind us, the forest had gone completely silent, except for our crashing footsteps and ragged breathing. It took 3 hours to reach the road where I'd parked, and another hour for the other search teams to find us after my radio calls. Lucas couldn't explain what had happened, just remembered walking into the woods and then waking up in the clearing with me shaking him. The search teams found the carved trees and wooden figures, but no clearing where the GPS coordinates indicated. The sheriff's department officially closed the case as a successful rescue, and Lucas's parents were too relieved to ask many questions. But I know those things are still out there, wearing the faces of the missing, walking their eternal circles, waiting for the next person to follow the trail of wooden figures into clearings that don't exist. I quit search and rescue the next week and moved 2 states away. Sometimes I dream about Danny, the real Danny, and wonder if any part of him is still in those woods, or if he's just another empty thing wearing familiar clothes, beckoning people deeper into the trees with too many teeth in his smile. Four years have passed since that weekend in Cheat Mountain, and I still wake up at 3 a.m. sometimes, convinced I can hear those branches snapping in sequence outside my window. I was 28 then, living in Elkins, West Virginia, doing construction work with a crew I'd been tight with since high school. Pete, our foreman, was this stocky ex-Marine who could track a deer through solid rock if he wanted to. Julio handled all our electrical installations, always cracking jokes about how the mountain folks still thought electricity was witchcraft. And Sam, our plumber, was the kind of guy who brought a fishing rod everywhere, even to job sites, just in case he spotted a decent creek during lunch break. That particular Friday in early August, we'd wrapped up a brutal week renovating an old textile mill that had been abandoned since the 70s. The place gave everyone the creeps. Rusted machinery everywhere. Walls covered in this weird yellowish mold that made your eyes water if you stared at it too long. Pete suggested we clear our heads with a camping trip up to this spot he'd been hunting near since his dad first took him there in the 90s. He kept going on about these pristine streams full of native brook trout, meadows where you could see elk if you got up early enough, and best of all, absolutely no cell service for 40 miles in any direction. After breathing in demolition dust and that awful mold for 5 straight days, sleeping under actual stars sounded like medicine. We drove out Saturday morning in Pete's beat-up Chevy Silverado, the truck bed loaded with enough gear to survive a month if we needed to. The route took us through these winding mountain roads that got narrower with every mile, asphalt giving way to gravel, then finally just dirt tracks carved between massive red spruce trees. Julio kept making jokes about banjo music and asking if we'd packed enough ammunition, but even he went quiet when we hit the real wilderness. The trees up there were different from anything near town. Ancient things with trunks so thick you'd need 5 people holding hands to wrap around them. The air tasted clean but somehow heavy, like it was full of secrets that had been fermenting for centuries. Pete parked at this unmarked pull-off about 2 miles from where the actual trail started. Said his dad always told him the best spots were the ones you had to earn. We hiked for maybe 3 hours, following what Pete swore was a trail but looked more like random gaps between the undergrowth to the rest of us. Around noon, we crested this ridge and saw the meadow Pete had been promising. This perfect bowl of grass, surrounded by dark forest on all sides, with a stream cutting through the middle that sparkled like broken glass in the sunlight. We set up camp near the tree line, close enough to the water to hear it babbling, but far enough back to avoid the morning dew. Everything seemed perfect until Sam noticed the other campsite. About 200 yards upstream, tucked between 3 massive boulders that formed a natural windbreak, someone had built what I can only describe as the most professional wilderness setup I'd ever seen. Not just a tent thrown up for the night. This was architecture. They'd lashed together fallen branches with paracord to create this elevated platform about 4 feet off the ground, probably to avoid moisture and animals. A tarp stretched overhead at precise angles that would channel rain away perfectly. The fire pit was lined with flat stones fitted together like a mason had done it, with a metal grate suspended at just the right height for cooking. Everything about it screamed military precision, but what really got us was how invisible it was. If Sam hadn't been scouting for fishing spots upstream, we'd never have seen it behind those boulders. Pete went into full Marine mode, circling the camp with his eyes scanning every detail, while the rest of us hung back. He pointed out things we'd missed, the wood pile stacked in order of thickness, kindling to logs, all cut to exact lengths, a water filtration system made from plastic bottles and sand and charcoal, sophisticated enough to turn swamp water drinkable, snare lines coiled and hung from specific branches, ready to deploy. But no personal items anywhere. No sleeping bag, no backpack, no clothes. Nothing that said someone actually lived there. Julio joked that maybe we'd found Bigfoot's summer home, but his laugh came out forced and nervous. Pete crouched next to the fire pit, held his hand over the ashes, then pulled it back fast. The coals underneath were still warm. We decided to head back to our own camp, nobody saying out loud what we were all thinking. Whoever built that setup was probably watching us right now. The afternoon passed weird and tense, everyone trying to act normal but jumping at every sound from the forest. Sam gave up on fishing after an hour, said the stream felt wrong somehow, like the fish knew something we didn't. Around 4 o'clock, Pete suggested we collect firewood before dark, and that's when we found the first carcass. It was strung up between 2 trees about 50 yards from our camp. A rabbit with its fur stripped clean off, the pink muscle underneath glistening in the filtered sunlight. The rope work was intricate. Not just a simple noose, but these complex knots that held the animal spread out like it was on display. Pete cut it down with his knife, his jaw clenched tight, and we found 3 more just like it forming a rough circle around our campsite. Julio wanted to leave right then, pack everything up and drive back to town, but Pete convinced us to stay. Said whoever did this was just trying to scare us off, that if they wanted to hurt us, they would have already. He'd seen this kind of psychological stuff in Afghanistan. He said, locals warning foreigners to stay away from certain valleys. We built our fire bigger than necessary that night, nobody admitting we were scared, but all of us feeding logs into it until the flames jumped 6 feet high. We cooked our hot dogs and drank our beers and tried to tell normal camping stories, but every conversation died after a few sentences. The darkness beyond our fire circle felt alive and hostile, pressing in from all sides. Then around midnight, Sam grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises and pointed at the tree line with a trembling finger. There was a man standing perfectly still between 2 pine trees, maybe 30 feet from our camp. The firelight barely reached him, just enough to show the outline of torn military fatigues and a beard that hung down to his chest in matted gray ropes. His eyes reflected the flames like a nocturnal animal's, 2 orange dots floating in the darkness. But what made my whole body go rigid with terror was how long he'd probably been there. None of us had heard him approach. No snapped twigs, no rustled leaves, nothing. Pete slowly stood up, his hand moving to the knife on his belt, and called out asking if the man needed help. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there watching us with those burning eyes. After maybe 30 seconds that felt like hours, he took 1 step backward and vanished into the black forest without making a single sound. Pete grabbed his flashlight and swept it across the trees where the man had been standing, but there was nothing. No footprints in the pine needles, no broken branches, no sign anyone had been there at all. We stayed up the rest of the night, sitting back to back, taking turns keeping watch while the others tried to doze off. Every time the fire popped or the wind moved a branch, we'd all jerk awake with our hearts hammering. When the first gray light of dawn finally filtered through the canopy, we discovered our visitor had left us a message. All 4 of the animal carcasses we'd cut down the day before were hanging in our camp, strung up from the exact same trees where we'd hung our food bags to keep them away from bears. But here's what really messed with our heads. The rope was our rope, taken from our packs without any of us noticing, and tied with the same elaborate knots we'd seen before. We packed up in complete silence, throwing our gear into bags without even rolling up the sleeping bags properly, just wanting to get out of there as fast as possible. Pete kept scanning the forest while we worked, his marine training taking over, moving in these practiced patterns that covered every angle. As we were taking down the last tent, Julio found something carved into the tree where it had been staked. Fresh cuts in the bark forming letters. SM 73 to 17. Pete went pale when he saw it, said he needed to check something when we got back to town. We practically ran down the trail to the truck, that 3-hour hike taking us less than 90 minutes, nobody caring about the scratches from branches or the twisted ankles from moving too fast over rough ground. The entire time I kept feeling eyes on my back, that crawling sensation of being tracked by something that knew these woods infinitely better than we ever could. The drive back to Elkins was dead quiet except for Pete muttering to himself and typing frantically on his phone whenever we hit a patch of cell service. At his apartment, he pulled out this old hunting magazine from 2003 with an article about mysterious disappearances in Cheat Mountain. There was a sidebar about local legends, including something called the Ghost Ranger, supposedly a Special Forces soldier named Scott Maddox, who went AWOL in 1973 after a psychiatric break, disappeared into the mountains, and was presumed dead after a massive search found nothing. But hunters and hikers had been reporting strange encounters for decades. Sophisticated camps that appeared and vanished overnight, animal carcasses arranged in ritualistic patterns, and glimpses of a wild-looking man in old military gear who moved through the forest like smoke. The article mentioned that Maddox, if alive, would be in his 70s by then. Pete looked at the date carved in that tree again. 73-17, 1973 to 2017. 44 years. We never went back to Cheat Mountain, and we never talked about it at work. But sometimes I catch Pete staring at nothing with this haunted look. And I know he's thinking about those orange eyes in the darkness, wondering if Scott Maddox is still out there, still watching, still warning people away from whatever he's protecting or hiding from in those endless woods. Most people go to the mountains for peace and quiet, but I went there chasing sounds. I was finishing up my wildlife biology degree, 21 years old, and desperate to record nocturnal animal vocalizations for my senior thesis. Professor Whitman had loaned me the department's best equipment: infrared cameras, parabolic microphones, motion sensors, the whole setup probably worth more than my beat-up Ford Ranger. I'd picked Unaka Mountain specifically because hardly anyone camped there anymore. The ranger at the station even tried to talk me out of it, said the trails were poorly maintained and cell service was non-existent past the first mile. Perfect conditions for undisturbed wildlife observation, I thought. I told him I'd be fine, that I'd done plenty of solo camping before, which was mostly true if you counted sleeping in my backyard as a kid. Setting up camp that first afternoon felt routine enough. I found a flat spot about 4 miles up the mountain, surrounded by thick hemlocks and rhododendron bushes that formed natural walls around my tent. The fog rolled in around 5 o'clock, earlier than expected, turning everything past 20 feet into a gray blur. While organizing my equipment, I noticed these weird indentations in the soft dirt near my tent. Not quite footprints, more like drag marks mixed with small handprints. They formed a circle around where I'd placed my gear, as if something had crawled around inspecting everything while I was away gathering firewood. I figured it was probably a raccoon or possum, though the pattern didn't match anything I'd studied. The spacing was all wrong, too wide for any animal I knew, and the hand marks had 5 distinct fingers but seemed stretched out, like someone had grabbed the dirt and pulled themselves forward. That first night I stayed up until 3 in the morning with my recording equipment running. The forest was alive with typical sounds: barred owls calling, deer moving through the underbrush, the occasional rustle of small mammals. Around 2:30 though, everything went completely silent. Not the gradual quieting you get when a predator passes through, but an instant cutoff, like someone had hit a mute button on the entire forest. Then I heard it. A low rhythmic humming coming from somewhere beyond the ring of hemlocks. It wasn't quite musical, more like someone trying to remember a tune they'd heard once, hitting wrong notes and starting over. The sound moved in a slow circle around my camp, always staying just out of sight in the fog. I aimed my parabolic microphone toward it, watching the levels spike on my recorder, but the humming stopped the moment I moved. 20 minutes later, the normal forest sounds returned all at once, and I convinced myself it had been another researcher or maybe a lost hiker, though I couldn't explain why they'd circle my camp instead of approaching for help. The next morning, I discovered my hiking boots had been moved. I'd left them outside my tent, caked with mud from the previous day's trek, but now they sat perfectly aligned at the tent entrance, cleaned, spotless. not just wiped down, cleaned like someone had taken a wet cloth to every groove in the treads. The laces were even retied in neat, symmetrical bows. My first thought was that another camper had played a prank, but I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and the nearest established campsite was miles away. More of those crawling marks surrounded my tent, fresher than before, pressed deep into the morning dew-dampened earth. This time, I could make out what looked like knee impressions alongside the handprints, and the pattern suggested something moving on all fours, but with limbs too long for its body, having to spread wide to maintain balance. I spent that day setting up my cameras in a wider perimeter, determined to capture whatever was visiting my camp. The fog never lifted, just shifted between thick and thicker, making visibility past 30 feet impossible. While adjusting one of the infrared cameras, I found something that made me stop breathing for a moment. A small pile of bones arranged in a perfect spiral pattern on a flat rock. They were delicate, probably from birds or rodents, picked completely clean and bleached white. At the center sat a single human tooth, a child's molar judging by the size. I picked it up with shaking fingers, noting how the root was still intact, not broken, but somehow extracted whole. I wrapped it in tissue paper and tucked it in my backpack, thinking maybe I should report it to the rangers, though I kept finding excuses not to hike back down. My thesis deadline was approaching, I told myself, and I hadn't collected enough data yet. The third night brought the first real contact. I'd fallen asleep in my tent around midnight, exhausted from staying vigilant the previous nights. A soft scratching against the tent fabric woke me, not aggressive, almost gentle, like someone running their fingernails across the material in slow, deliberate strokes. The scratching moved from the foot of my tent up along the side, pausing occasionally as if feeling for something specific. Through the thin fabric backlit by my dimming campfire, I could see the shadow of whatever was outside. The proportions were all wrong. Arms that reached too far, a torso too short for the length of its limbs, and a head that seemed to bob and weave independent of its body movements. It crawled around my tent 3 times, humming that broken melody again, occasionally pressing what I assumed was its face against the fabric, creating brief indentations that made me pull my sleeping bag tighter around myself. When morning came, I found my equipment disturbed again, but this time with purpose. The memory cards from 2 of my cameras had been removed and placed in a neat stack on my camp chair. The third camera, the one facing my tent, was still recording. I grabbed it with trembling hands and reviewed the footage on the small LCD screen. Most of it showed nothing but fog and darkness, but at 3:47 a.m., there it was. The image quality was poor, grainy, and washed out by the infrared, but I could see it clearly enough. Something pale and elongated crawling into frame, moving with a horrible fluidity that reminded me of a contortionist. Its limbs bent at too many points, as if it had extra joints in its fingers. God, those fingers, stretched impossibly long as it pulled itself forward. The head was the worst part, turned at an angle that should have broken its neck, facing the camera while its body moved in a different direction. The features were blurred, but I could make out 2 dark spots where eyes should be and something that might have been a mouth, opened wide in what looked like a permanent silent scream. I packed up most of my gear that morning, planning to leave, but stopped at the trailhead parking area when I saw an old local man refilling the trail map box. His name was Earl, according to his volunteer badge, and when I asked him about the history of this particular section of Unica Mountain, his whole demeanor changed. He told me about a boy named Christopher who disappeared up here in 1976, only 7 years old, wandered off from his family's picnic. They found his shoes 2 weeks later, cleaned and placed neatly on a rock, but never found him. Earl leaned in close, smelling like tobacco and wood smoke, and whispered that some folks believed Christopher never really left, that something in these mountains changed him, made him into something else. Mountains are old, he said, older than most things, and sometimes they keep what they take, just change it around some. He wouldn't say more, just shook his head and walked back to his pickup truck. Despite every instinct screaming at me to drive away, I went back up the mountain. I needed more footage, more evidence, something that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. That night, I set up all my cameras facing inward toward my tent and sat in my camp chair with a flashlight and bear spray, determined to confront whatever had been stalking me. The humming started earlier this time, around 11 o'clock, but now it came from multiple directions, as if there were 3 or 4 sources weaving between the trees. The fog was so thick I could barely see my own feet, and the moisture in the air made everything feel cold and clammy against my skin. Then I heard something that made my chest tighten, a child's voice, high and sweet, singing "Ring Around the Rosie" in slow, dragging notes. But the words were wrong, twisted somehow. "Ashes, ashes, we crawl down," repeated over and over until the syllables lost meaning and became just sounds, wet and gargling. The singing stopped when it reached the edge of my camp's light. I swept my flashlight across the tree line and caught a glimpse of pale skin between the rhododendron leaves, maybe 15 feet away. It wasn't hiding, just waiting there, swaying slightly like a tree in the wind. I called out, asked if someone needed help, and the thing responded by dropping to all fours and scuttling sideways like a crab, those long limbs folding and unfolding in ways that hurt to watch. It circled me twice, always staying just at the edge of visibility, and I could hear its breathing now, ragged and wet, like lungs full of water. When it finally approached, crawling low with its belly almost touching the ground, I saw its face clearly for the first time. The features were human but stretched wrong, like someone had grabbed a child's face and pulled it over a skull too large. The eyes were black, too big, and they didn't blink, just stared while that mouth opened and closed, making no sound but that horrible wet breathing. I didn't run. I couldn't. Every muscle in my body had locked up, and all I could do was sit there gripping my flashlight while this thing studied me with those unblinking black eyes. It reached out one impossibly long arm and touched my boot, just like it had cleaned them before, running those stretched fingers along the laces with an almost tender curiosity. Then it spoke, or tried to. The voice was layered, like a child talking underwater mixed with something else, something older and broken. "Play with me." The words came out wrong, too slow, like it was remembering how speech worked. Repeated the phrase 7 or 8 times, each iteration becoming less human, more like an animal trying to mimic sounds it had heard. When I finally found my voice and screamed, the creature jerked back, scrambling away on all fours into the fog, but not before leaving something in the dirt beside my chair, a small school photo, water-damaged and yellowed, showing a boy with dark hair and a gap-toothed smile. On the back, in a mother's careful handwriting, "Christopher, age 7, spring 1976. I left everything behind except my car keys and the photo. Drove straight through the night back to campus, didn't stop until I reached my apartment building's parking lot. For 3 days, I convinced myself it was over, that whatever that thing was, it belonged to the mountain and would stay there. But then I started noticing things. My apartment door's deadbolt would be unlocked when I came home, though I always locked it when leaving. My shoes would be rearranged in my closet, organized by size and color. One night I woke to find my bedroom window open, the screen pushed out, and muddy handprints on the sill. Too long, too thin, with too many joints. The humming started again last week, always between 2 and 3 in the morning, coming from the alley behind my building. I've stopped sleeping, stopped going to classes. I keep Christopher's photo on my nightstand now, hoping maybe it wants it back, hoping that will make it stop. But deep down, I know the truth that Earl tried to warn me about. The mountain doesn't just keep what it takes. Sometimes what it takes follows you home, looking for someone new to play with, someone new to change. People assume search and rescue work is all adrenaline, flares, helicopters, barking dogs. But most of the time, it's quiet. You're alone in the woods, following a track that's already grown cold, hoping for a miracle, and preparing to find something you wish you hadn't. I've been volunteering up here in the White Mountains for about 6 years, mainly weekends. That day, we got called in for a solo hiker. Woman in her 30s, experienced, had signed in at the trailhead, but never came out. Her car was still in the lot 2 days later. We were told to sweep a known route. Standard terrain, not too technical, no storms in the area. It sounded routine. The kind of call where we usually find someone just off trail with a twisted ankle and an empty water bottle. I was paired with a guy named Ellis, newer than me, maybe early 20s, way too upbeat for that early in the morning. We were assigned a lower elevation loop near an area called Echo Notch. The section had a couple of unmaintained forks, old hunting paths mostly, and gullies that swallowed sound like thick velvet. While Ellis focused on shouting the woman's name, I handled the GPS tracker we used to log our progress. Nothing special, just breadcrumbs on a map. But when I compared our map to hers, we'd been given the track from her personal GPS device, something stood out. She'd stopped in 3 completely unrelated spots. Small depressions, way off trail. No water sources, no shelters, nothing to indicate she'd rest there. Just strange hollows tucked into the landscape. The kind of places you only notice if you're standing in them, because they don't show up in your periphery. No light filters properly into them, like the forest wants to hide them. That bugged me. I marked them with red pins and didn't say anything to Ellis yet. Didn't want to sound paranoid. But as we hiked closer to the first location she'd paused in for nearly 20 minutes, I got uneasy. It wasn't just the silence. I've heard the kind of silence that falls when birds leave an area. This wasn't that. This felt like we were walking into a place where sound had never lived in the first place. I don't know how else to describe it. There was no scent of pine, no breeze, nothing but the subtle pressure you get before a thunderstorm. Except there were no clouds. We didn't find her there. Just a circle of disturbed moss like someone had sat for a while or squatted low. But what really caught my eye was a faint line gouged into the dirt, maybe 2 feet long. At first I thought it was a branch drag, but there were no broken twigs or leaves and it was too straight. Clean, purposeful. I took a photo with my phone, even though we're not technically supposed to document things outside of dispatch reports. Ellis joked that maybe she just needed a bathroom break. I didn't laugh. She'd stayed in that spot for too long, and if it was just to rest, why choose a place that didn't even feel breathable? The second hollow was worse. We reached it around mid-afternoon. Sun still high, but it barely touched the forest floor in that spot. The trees grew so tightly together it looked unnatural, like someone had planted them deliberately to choke out the light. This time, the GPS said she'd stayed even longer, almost 40 minutes. I started to think maybe she hadn't stopped voluntarily. There were no signs of a fall, no gear dropped, but something about the area felt observed. Not watched in the usual way. Not like a deer peering through brush or some guy with binoculars. It felt structured, like the air itself was monitoring us. Ellis didn't seem to notice. He kept walking, talking about his dog, his classes, his playlist for the drive home. I wanted to tell him to shut up, but I couldn't figure out why it bothered me so much. Maybe I didn't want to wake something up. We didn't say much on the way to the third spot. Something about the way the trail narrowed, then vanished, made it hard to keep up the usual SAR banter. It was nearly dusk when we reached the final point logged on her GPS. There was a shallow incline covered in loose rock, and at the top, a scatter of boulders that looked like they'd been tossed there by hand. Her pack was buried beneath them. Not set down, not stashed. Buried. Ellis called it in immediately while I crouched to examine it. There was no blood, no torn straps, no animal sign. Just a full sealed pack hidden under 3 heavy rocks that didn't belong there. I looked up, scanning the trees for movement, and that's when I saw it. A trail camera. Old, weatherproof casing, mounted high. Too high for a solo hiker to place it. Someone had climbed to get it up there. It was pointed straight at the spot where the bag had been hidden. Not aimed randomly, not facing the trail. I got this sick feeling in my spine. Not fear exactly, but a creeping sense of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Like the woods were tolerating us just barely. I asked Ellis if he saw the camera. He squinted, nodded slowly, then asked if I thought it was part of wildlife research. I didn't answer. I was already taking pictures again, even though my phone battery was almost gone. I needed proof. The pack, the rocks, the camera. They didn't belong together naturally. Someone had planned this. We left a flag marker, logged our coordinates, and hiked out before nightfall. Ellis kept glancing back down the trail, which he hadn't done once all day. That told me everything. Back at the base, I pulled the other recent missing person cases from our log. 3 in the last 6 months, all in different zones, and all had GPS traces with the same pattern, brief stops in unnatural spots. I overlaid the maps. The rest points formed a rough spiral if you looked at them from high enough, like someone was testing something, calibrating. And if that trail cam had footage, someone was watching the results. I went back alone the next morning. I told the team I forgot to mark something properly. It wasn't a complete lie. I brought a climbing strap, gloves, and a second battery for my phone. When I reached the tree, it took me longer than I expected to get up there. The bark was half rotted in some places, and there was a rusted nail sticking out just under the camera, like it had been mounted and remounted. The SD card was still in it. No lock, no wires, no brand label. I pocketed it and left fast, didn't bother to check the other hollows again. Whatever this was, it wasn't about one missing person. I was sure of that now. Back at home, I didn't plug the card into my laptop right away. I let it sit on my desk for a few hours, like it might change if I left it alone. When I finally opened it, there were 7 folders. 6 were labeled with dates I didn't recognize. The last one had no name. Inside were time-stamped images, motion-triggered, maybe 5 to 10 seconds apart. Most showed nothing but empty woods. Then a figure would appear, walking, crouching, sometimes standing completely still just outside the center frame. The person always wore the same clothes, but the face was different each time. Blurred, not by movement, but like something was wrong with the way the camera processed it. Like it couldn't hold the shape. I made it through maybe 100 photos before I saw her. The missing woman, standing under that same tree, backpack still on. She was looking up at the lens. No panic on her face, just resignation. There were no photos after that. The file sequence ended. I pulled the card out, crushed it with a hammer in my garage, and burned the pieces in my fire pit. I know that was stupid, maybe even irresponsible, but I didn't want anyone else to see what I saw. I didn't want to give whoever put that camera up there a reason to come looking for it. I still volunteer, but I don't take tech calls anymore. I avoid anything with GPS logs or trackers. If I hear a hiker's path shows weird detours, I let someone else take it. I've even thought about quitting altogether, but then I remember that someone out there is keeping score, watching, learning, getting better. And if there's even a small chance I'll be able to stop them from taking the next person, or at least make sure they're not forgotten, then I'll keep walking the woods. I just don't stop in the hollows anymore, not even for a second.